Hi, I'm CJ and this is my RC channel. Okay, the first step in doing the outer wing sections is cutting the carbon rods and tubes. So, as you may know from watching earlier videos and previous videos, I try not to waste stock if I can help it, especially when it comes to carbon fiber, because you never know when you're going to need a piece for some, project you're doing on the side. And so in any event, we have our two large tubes. For whatever reason, one's longer than the other. It's probably just that they were, taking, long sections of stock and cutting them into sections, and there was just, the end piece with a little extra on it, and they tossed it in. As you can see, they are both more than long enough to go from where they end inside the wing out to the outer rib. And this is where the wing connects to the center section. So we'll be trimming this off after we've done our dihedral. Excuse me for banging the camera there. So we don't need to do anything with these. Even the longer one, we'll just trim that edge off. It's no trouble working with a little bit of extra hanging off. And I keep hitting the camera. Okay, now we come to our longer pieces. Let's just look for a second at the three sections that we have. We have this piece, this longer leading edge piece. This is spar. And then we have another piece of leading edge. Now, if you did your first section, the center section, the way I did, and you moved the rod off center and left yourself some extra, you've already got one of the pieces you're going to need for the outer wing. It's more than long enough. So if you take your the section that you would normally cut into two pieces to make these, it's more than long enough. So if you just cut it, giving yourself some buffer. As you can see, I've got these pieces of tape wrapped around, and I've got an arrow, so I know which side I'm going to cut, because I'm going to be cutting these outdoors. I'm not going to be sitting here and doing it, because you don't want carbon fiber in your environment. So I left myself a decent amount of scrap off the edge here, or slop if you will, and that's going to leave me a nice piece of carbon fiber for something else down the road that I may need it for. So that'll give me my two outer wing pieces right there. Now, then we need our inner wing, the inner outer wing section. So if you measure from my tape line, again, I've left myself about 3/8 of an inch of buffer. And from the other cut, again, about the same amount of buffer, about 1/4 inch of buffer. Now, that leaves me another little piece of carbon scrap. This is something that I could use to use for a hatch, a spring for a hatch or something like that. In any event, it's worth hanging on to. So I'm going to go ahead and cut what I need with a safe buffer and have myself a little bit of leftover. We don't have that luxury with this section here. And this is where it gets a little tricky. As you can see, again, I've got arrows, so I know where I'm cutting. So first, I'm going to cut my, because remember, you've got 4 sections of this spar. You've got one here and a matching one on the other wing, and then you've got the outer section as well. Don't forget that you've got to cut this. So if you notice here, I'm going right to the line here where this is supposed to go inside the other tube, and I've left myself about 3 millimeters of scrap, because there's only so much on this one tube here. Okay, then if we look from this cut line to this one, that gives us our outer wing section with a little more of a buffer, maybe almost a 1/2 inch of buffer. Then if you look at it from the opposite side, again, we have our cut line here, and that gives us about 3 millimeters of buffer. And then from our cut line here to this cut line, that gives us our other wingtip with, again, more like a 1/2 inch of scrap. So that gives us our 4 pieces. I've got the inner pieces at the outer cuts here and here, and then I have a 3rd cut here to give me my 2 sections here. So that's 4 pieces, and that's not going to leave any leftover of any consequence. So I highly recommend doing this method that I've got here, using some tape and putting arrows so you know on which side of the tape you're going to make any particular cut, because once you start making cuts to pieces, it starts getting, you know, complicated to remember which one you're supposed to cut on. I suppose you could use some type of marker, but marker can be hard to see on black carbon fiber, so especially once you're out in the sun and you've got a nice reflection on it. So again, using that same saw and that same micro saw blade that worked so nicely the last time on the inner wing section, I'm going to go out and cut these pieces and come back. And before I start video again, I'm going to go through the process of cutting out all of these pieces, and I'm going to line them up in numerical order on the table so I know what's what and I'm ready to start putting things together. Then I'm going to take the little ring spacers. I've got those out here. These were one of the things I cut early on, and I put them in a little snack size Ziploc bag, and now I know right where they are. So this is a good way to go to keeping things organized. I need these 4 rings, and I'm going to put 2 rings on each of these carbon tubes here, and then insert them into these tubes. I will show you that process. One of the recommendations that I saw, just to kind of jump ahead here, we're basically creating this joint here between 2 spars. And the recommendation I saw was using 5-minute epoxy to glue the rings on, and then filling the space in between the rings with more 5-minute epoxy. In other words, the empty space in between these 2 tubes, capped off by those 2 rings, is supposed to be filled with 5-minute epoxy. Now, how you would get that completely filled, I don't know. The next problem is if you don't get equal amounts of epoxy in there, you're dealing with a slight weight difference from one side to the other. It would probably be negligible, but I don't think I'm going to do that. I think what I'm going to do is put just enough 5-minute epoxy into I'm not really sure what I'm going to do. I want to use as little glue as possible. I don't want to weight this down. I don't think it needs to be filled with glue. I really don't. And I'm not even sure epoxy is the way to go. CA works so well on carbon fiber, and it might be better to just CA these in place, at least on this tube here, and then use some 5-minute epoxy to join them together. But I'm definitely not going to try to fill that void, because that's a lot of extra weight. It probably would be a good, I don't know, 1/2 ounce maybe of glue. And unlike CA, 5-minute epoxy doesn't evaporate, or it doesn't lose weight from the hardening process or the setting process. CA glue is very light to begin with per volume, and then it kind of it dries, it evaporates a little bit, and you don't carry as much weight onto your onto the model as you would if you were to fill this void with 5-minute epoxy. Now, the only thing I can conceive of them wanting that for is that they're thinking that, you know, with the stress of this motion here, that these discs would have to crush for them to fail. Literally, you'd have to collapse that wood. And it's not balsa, it's at least 2 millimeter thick plywood. And it's if this is CA'd well, it almost ceases to be wood at that point. It almost becomes a composite material when it's totally saturated with thin CA. That's not going to crush. I just don't see that breaking. I don't see it coming undone. So I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to decide, and I'll let you know what I come up with. But yeah, definitely not going to fill that thing with 5-minute epoxy and put a ton of weight outboard on the wing that I don't need to. Okay, as you can see, the cutting was successful. I've got 2 pieces here that each have a little bit of overlap. I've got 2 pieces here that each have a little bit of overlap. I've got leading edge here. This is the one that I didn't have to cut, the piece that I already had. Here are my other 2 leading edges, each with some overhang, and here's what I have left over. So everything went well. Now, 2 things to help you with the cutting. Number 1, when you're cutting solid rods or thin tubes like this, the best thing to do is to make a couple of strokes, rotate between your fingers a little bit, a couple more strokes, rotate a little more, a couple more strokes. That way you're basically cutting all the way around the edge before you've cut fully through. That way there's less of a chance of you know, tearing away and having an end that's like frayed or split. Now when you're cutting these tubes, it's good to have a little miter box. This is an aluminum miter box that I got with a saw kit a while back. It came with some of those razor saws that you've seen me use, and that is extremely handy for getting nice clean cuts where it's hard to tell where it was done at the factory and where you did it. So likewise with the with the rod, I cut all the way down almost to the very bottom and then rotate about a quarter turn and use the existing slot that's already been cut to line up the edge, and then continue cutting that last little bit, because you're not going to be able to cut all the way down to the bottom and come through easy, because the blade has a bit of flex to it. It'll bow, and so it won't fully hit bottom. So that also, that's, you know, what gave me these nice clean cuts, is using this. Now, you know, down the road I'm gonna have to cut off excess, but regardless, you know, one of the ends of these is gonna be inside, you know, the wing here, or, you know, up against the outer edge here. So when I build this, there's no dihedral back here, so I'm gonna be lining up one of these ends with the end rib and making it flush. And you want this to be a nice clean cut. You don't want it to be, you know, jagged or angled. So if you can get yourself one of these, I highly recommend it. It's something you'll use again and again and again. You're not going to use it every day. You may not even use it on every build, but if you like building wood-based kits, and as opposed to foamies, you're definitely going to want this down the road. Okay, I rubber banded these 4 pieces together, the outermost section pieces, because I didn't want to mistake one of these, because they are almost the same length, at least the longest one is, and I didn't want to make a mistake and end up short, grabbing the wrong one. So I just did that to set them aside, and that way they're also not rolling around. So I've taken the 4 rings, and I'm just leaving about 1 millimeter at the edge, and then line them up, and they're supposed to be one full wing rib distance apart. And so I lined them up on the plans. You could also use the, let's see, this must be for the, interesting. Okay, so this is one of these things that just is a little strange, and it may or may not come up as a problem. Let's look at our trailing edge. Our trailing edge is the same size. We know we've got it in the right orientation because there's a small hole here, and we've got a small hole there. Also, the outermost wing section gets built upside down. We'll talk about that a little later. The main reason is because we're going to be building in washout, and I'll explain that later. But if you notice, our ribs, if we line up our jig, our outermost rib is not in the correct place according to the plans. Let me just take a look at this one. This is for our main section here, and yes, that doesn't include the one with washout. Wait a minute, I see what's going on here. Okay, there we go. I was looking at this piece here, and this is going to have dihedral angle, so that's not included in the jig process. The outermost one here is further away, and I wasn't paying attention to that because I was looking at these solid pieces here, which are these, and that's also interesting because the that really doesn't give us our correct rib, but yeah, I guess this goes here and caps. So we're going to have a rib in its normal position, then we're going to laminate this fat rib that doesn't have a hole in it for the carbon fiber, and then as you can see, this little indication here, this indicates that we're going to be shaping this rib here is going to be placed vertically like that, but then we're going to shape it like a bit of an airfoil for our outer wing surface or edge. Same thing kind of going here with these pieces. We're going to stack up two of these one on top of another. We're going to glue them in here, and then we're going to have to shape them to match the airfoil here and here. So that's something we'll be covering later. So there is no issue with this jig because this jig is, it's this inner rib here. It's the outermost rib, but it doesn't include this wood section, which I was focusing on incorrectly. So no issue there. Everything is as it should be. Okay, so back to this section here. Like I said, you could confirm your distance by holding the jig against these two little wooden rings, and they are one rib span, full rib span apart. So now I'm going to glue them on with thin CA, and then I'm going to make a decision about what I'm going to glue them in here with. But first I need to let them fully dry, and then I need to do any sanding that's necessary. I didn't have to do any sanding on the inner holes. The inner holes were just fine. They were a little snug to slip on, except one of them, which was a teeny bit loose, but not, you know, not that it's an issue. And then, like I said, you also should compare one against the other. Make sure you've got the same amount of carbon fiber tube sticking out the end. I would use as little as possible sticking out. There's just no need. You could almost go flush, but it's probably nice to have a little bit of a fillet. So it shouldn't take more than a drop or two. Yeah, one drop pretty much worked its way all the way around. do one on either side. Just tapping off any excess. Okay, so I'm going to let these sit for a few minutes, let them completely dry, and while they're drying, I'm going to decide what I'm going to do as far as gluing. Okay, I've just mixed up some 5-minute. I'm going to go ahead and do epoxy, but I'm not going to fill the space in between. I am going to try to fill it. This piece, the inner ring and the outer ring, I'm going to fill it a little bit too. Now I'm going to put a little bit of 5-minute in here, and that'll get pushed in by this piece, kind of like a plunger. That way we know that we're getting glue down on the end ring there. I want to make sure I get enough on there. Just getting off the excess. And I'm going to push that in so it's about 1 millimeter in. And I'm going to take a little more epoxy, and I'm going to fill that space. And now I'm going to wipe off the excess. Now I've got enough, well, probably not enough to do the second one. So, and that was kind of the plan. 5-minute, sets up pretty quick depending on how long you spend mixing. So I'm just gonna let this stand upright so it doesn't drip. One thing I've picked up about 5-minute epoxy over the years is that this is particularly true of 5-minute. If you do a milder mix job, you get a more flexible, the glue, any large amount of it, like that you use for a fillet, will tend to be a little more rubbery, a little more pliable. If you blend it or mix it to the point where it's changing color, where it almost turns white with little air bubbles, you'll have a stronger, not necessarily stronger, but it'll be more brittle, it'll be harder, and it won't have that flexibility. And it's something that you kind of just learn to do by feel for the type of joint that you're doing. So just a little food for thought. And as usual, these little bamboo skewers come in wonderfully handy. You should be able to see in there pretty well. It's Like I said, I only depressed it about a millimeter, maybe a half millimeter, and then filled the space with 5 minute. So we've got a nice solid bond there. I put some on the inside, and that, you know, mainly to make sure that as I push this, it's like a plunger basically, as I was sliding that in, I wasn't wiping off all the glue. There would still be some when I got to the point where it's this far in, because it's basically going to smear it all the way down the walls, and if you get to the end and it's almost all gone, you're not getting a good glue joint here. Plus, having filleted this, that means that any runoff that, you know, comes around the sides is just going to enhance that fillet. So although we didn't fill this space, we've got a nice solid chunk of glue and wood here and here, because remember, this is also filleted at this end, and then again on the outside here. So we've got a good result here, and that should be solid and plenty strong without adding a bunch of extra weight, because that would be a lot of glue to fill that space if you tried to fill that completely full. I mean, basically you'd have to do what I just did, you know, that plunger effect, and then once you got it to about here, you'd have to you know, basically trickle more glue into the void and push it down. You'd probably need at least 30-minute or 45-minute epoxy. Otherwise the 5-minute would set up too fast before you could get enough glue into the space to fill it. You'd pretty much be like this, trying to get glue to run down in. So, you know, I just don't see how that gets done well, and I don't see how it benefits. It just adds weight. This is going to be very strong. Let's see how we're doing here. Yep, that's good and dry. So I can set this down and move on. Now, I'm going to do this off camera. You don't need to watch me glue this again and mix up glue and everything else. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to start cutting out the ribs, finish sanding them, and lining them up. And I'm basically going to just set my two spars down on my plans, and I'm going to slide the ribs on one at a time in order until I've got them all laid out, with the exception of the two outers. I also need to glue the hybrid ribs together. I've glued some of them together. I demonstrated previously how to do that, so you have them creating a proper airfoil. You basically use one of these as a guide, slide it under a piece of plastic or lay plastic over top of it, take your 3 pieces, lay them on top, get them all lined up so the hybrid airfoil conforms to the shape of the solid airfoil below under the plastic, and then hit these spots with glue. And as you can see, there's some little bit of space here, a little bit of space here. If I had tried to line those up so the keys were tight, I'd have this thing off angle. It wouldn't be a correct airfoil, and it ultimately wouldn't work. I wouldn't be able to laminate one to the other because one of them would be askew by at least a degree or so, and I'd have to cut away balsa and try to add balsa to the bottom to make them match, and it would be a nightmare. So that's what you need to do. And if you don't exactly remember how I did that, just refer to the previous wing video, which it should be 2 videos back. The last video was on fuselage, so go to the center wing section video and review that if necessary. Okay, the wing's getting laid up. Nothing's glued yet. I'm just getting things in place, but I wanted to talk about the dihedral, and if I can stop bumping the camera here. I wanted to kind of just confirm something about the dihedral, and that is, do you use these gauges just on one side or on both sides facing each other? And the easiest way to confirm what the designer intended was to take this piece, which goes, and I did it again, And again, sorry, this is just, I've got this really low to the table here so I can show you in close. So this gets glued in to one wing like this, and the other end of the spar comes in here, and that's when the wing gets put together. Okay, so since this is our absolute angle versus the gauge, what's this angle here? Okay, because that is the ultimate determiner. So, and I did it again. So if I measure out this angle, you can see it's 14 degrees, as this thing just doesn't want to get a, but there we go, it's 14 degrees. Whereas if you measure this angle here, there's our 7-degree angle. So we need this, we need to use the gauge on both ribs that face each other. These little suckers are really handy. They can be a pain to work with because it can really jump around. It's hard to get it to settle in sometimes, but it can really be a useful tool. So, okay, now that we know that we need to do the 7-degree angle at both sides, just pulling this back off here. So, I have run into the same issue with the trailing edge that we had with the center section, in that it is longer than the plans by just about 2 or 3 millimeters. So ultimately that's our end gauge right there. So I slid all the ribs onto the spar and positioned everything up, used the jig, and then anchored stuff down. I anchored the trailing edge, I pinned it down, and then used that along with the plans as a gauge to make sure that the wing was squared up on that, so that all of the ribs are backed into their appropriate slots. And as you can see here, I've also laid up the left side, and it's everything is pinned in place, so I can now pull the jig out. And now it's time to glue both of these up and then do the dihedral. And once I've got that done, I'll need the 5-degree for that side, the 7-degree for the outer side, and then the 7-degree again for this side here. And that will get these two done pretty much. There's always a little bit of finishing stuff to do, but I'm going to start by gluing these up. Basically, I'm just going to drop a drop of thin CA at each point here on the leading edge, 1 or 2 drops on the ribs where they contact the spar, and then 1 or 2 drops on the trailing edge. And then once those are done, I'll start working on our dihedral ribs, and I'll cover that with you. So you've seen how all this went together with the midsection. There's no point in you know, showing you me dripping glue into onto these various parts. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that off camera. You know, make sure that you put your hybrid rib in place there, and the other hybrid rib gets laminated to this piece here. I'm going to do it the same way I did it on the other one, where I'm not going to try to get an angle like that. I'm going to glue them together flat and then bevel the hole with sandpaper. And that will get done in a little bit. And then I'll have to trim the excess carbon fiber off of all these pieces, and then it's time to move on to these guys, which, as I mentioned earlier, are assembled upside down. And the reason for that is each of these pieces, these ribs have this little block here that will get trimmed off later. Do not cut these off as you're cutting the pieces out. Those prop up the ribs, as I said, upside down, but they provide a leveling point between here and here. Now that height is going to vary because the idea is to build a little bit of washout. In other words, these little feet here, for lack of a better word, are going to get shorter as we move further out toward the tip of the wing, thus making the wing have a bit of a warp built into it. And that is called washout. And the idea of washout is that when you start getting a stall, usually you get a stall to one side or the other. Sometimes you get a straight up stall. But if you've got a tip stall starting, you're going to lose lift at the outer edge of the wing. And to help prevent tip stalling, having the outer ribs tipped a little more down gives them a slightly different angle of attack, so you're less likely to tip stall out at the outer edge of to lose lift out here, because the angle of attack for those ribs is steeper. So I'm going to go ahead and glue these up and come back in a minute. Okay, first thing, you got pieces of scrap left. If you look carefully, you'll see that they are two different diameters. The larger diameter is what we were using for the inner section, the middle section of the wing. And the thinner stock is what we are using on the four outer sections. So when you're putting these things together, if you cut them the way I did, you've got some extra scrap. Do not mistakenly use the larger stock. So make sure that is set well aside so you don't accidentally pick it up and use it. Okay, now, as I mentioned earlier, this is designed to add washout, these little feet, and that's why we're building this upside down. In other words, this side is going to go with this wing section, and this piece will go with this wing section here. I'm sorry, I've got the camera too close. Let's pull out for a moment. Okay, we're building this upside down, so this, when flipped right side up, is going to go to this wing section here, and this one, when assembled, is going to flip over and go to this wing section here. Okay, simple. Now let's talk about construction on this piece here. So start by getting your main spar and start with the end piece, A27, and then A26, and so on, going towards the intersection. You don't put on the last piece, of course, because that piece is going to be slightly sanded, the hole for beveling, and then it's going to be set to 7 degrees. We'll do that once it's right side up. Now, if you notice, when you look at these little feet here that hold these up, we have a slight difference in height, about 1.5 millimeters, maybe 2 millimeters tops, and that is our washout. In other words, if these two pieces are centered, this piece here is going to be at a slightly different angle. See, if you line up the holes and then you line the feet up, you can see that it's higher at the tail than the nose. That means we're getting a little bit of rotation into all of these pieces, and that creates our washout. And that's really nice, because a lot of kits, the way you get washout is to flex once the wing is covered, flex the tip of the wing and heat the covering and hold it flexed while it dries, to basically warp the tip of the wing up a bit and get some washout in. This way it's built into the wingtip, and we don't have to worry about trying to do that by some other means, like heating it and cooling it, because that will eventually stretch back out. So what you want to do is, once you've got the ribs on the main spar and you've got your jig just, you know, basically in place on it, so you've got them spaced, lay it down and put a pin on either side of the spar, at the front or at the inside and the outside, to hold the spar on the plans in place. Then I used 3 pins in a line along this outer edge, so that this last rib is in position. Because remember, we have an issue with these being slightly longer than the plans. So we're just gonna square things up. So this allows you to place this rib just, you know, flush with the end. That way there's no trimming involved on the carbon at that end. All the excess is going to be out here. Okay, then you want to take pins and you want to anchor the rear of these ribs down against your worked surface, so that they are flush, and that way we're sure that we're going to get our warp in. Then use your leading edge and adjust the pieces so that they're all on the leading edge, and then gently pin the leading edge down. Have it so it's against it firmly, but when you're pressing down, have the T-pin just touch the carbon. You don't want it pushing down, because we don't want to alter that line. We don't want to add in any warpage that might contradict or change the amount that we're already getting with the washout. Okay, the reason you want to pin this in place is because these little half ribs are going to float. There's nothing to keep them at the correct angle in relationship to the other ribs. So having the leading edge in place, the leading edge gives you positioning, final positioning for all of the ribs. Okay, you can place this here, and I would, to make sure that you've got things oriented. I'm not going to glue this on here. Mine have a teeny bit of warp to them, and even if they were flat, I would want to have them right side up, so that I can make sure, because I can't see what I'm gluing, and I don't want to not have this glued to the full surface, the contact surface of the rib. So this is just here for the moment to position. So now what I need to do is I can remove my jig, and I can glue these spots all the way down, and I can glue the leading edge all the way down. Okay, once those 2 connections are made, this is fairly solid, and it can be flipped, unpinned and flipped over, and then the trailing edge will get glued in place, and then we'll glue in the wood sections here and here, and then we'll do the inner rib and set our dihedral. So that's what I'm going to do. It's put together, everything's pinned in place. I'm going to glue the ribs to the main spar, I'm going to glue the ribs to the leading edge, and that's that. Okay, little thing here that's kind of odd and may throw you off a little bit. Okay, this is our outer part of the wing that we're going to shape to get the outer section of the wing. A lot of planes have different types. Some have like a little flip up end, like a little canard. There's all kinds of ways of doing it. If I were making this for competition, I would have cut my leading edges so they went all the way, because this rib here has a notch, and it is shaped so that it is an extension of the others as far as its shape. In other words, if you were to use a longer piece of carbon here for the leading edge, this would fit perfectly. If you see what I mean. There's no deviation. Like this rib here isn't shorter by any more than it needs to be in line with the rest of them to continue the taper. I would be trying to get every bit of airfoil that I could. I would go ahead and make it out to here, and then I would glue this piece on to get my wingtip and just shape it a little bit, just round its edge a little bit, mainly just leave it for giving strength to here, and get that last little bit of airfoil. But since this is just a fun glider, I'm going to go ahead and build this the way they have it set up. Now, this kind of might throw you off because you'll see that notch and you're like, wait a minute, isn't my leading edge supposed to go to there? And, you know, no, it doesn't. And also, you've got a lot of balsa that you're going to be cutting away that, you know, like they didn't give us a rib specifically set up for this. So let's just put these here in place like this, and as you can see, we're going to be cutting off this whole section right here and then shaping this down. What's up, pup? Sorry, my Chihuahua is trying to get my attention. I'm not sure what she wants at the moment, but maybe I need to take her out front. In any event, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to follow the plans, cut away that extra material, and then shape all these blocks so that they all, you know, have a nice smooth trajectory to the edge of the wing and round it out the way they describe it here. So now it's time to get the trailing edge glued in place properly. I'm going to go ahead and pull these pins. I am leaving the pins that I've got here on either side of the main spar, at least for the moment. And actually that really doesn't help me out at all, because now that we're flipped over, I would really have to move this to the other side to line things up. And I may do that when I'm ready to figure out my dihedral here. But for the moment, let's go ahead and glue this trailing edge in place. So to start with, you see, this is why I didn't want to glue it while it was on it. If you can see, there's a bit of a warp here. If I set this down on the work surface and hold it flat, you can see that it's twisted up a little bit and torqued a little bit. Now that'll all work itself out when it's glued together, but I want to go ahead and I didn't want to glue it while it was just sitting there on top the way it was. So I'm going to go ahead and pull these. They're just going to get in my way. Okay. So what I need to do is put a couple pins down here to keep this from moving. So that keeps it from moving left and right, and these keep it from moving backwards away from the wing. I can go ahead and get these pieces into position so they fit into the notches. Okay, I'm gonna put a pin in there, put another pin here. Okay, that's got that held in place. And now put another pin here to keep this from moving. I just want to make sure that all of this rib surface is contacting the plywood firmly, because you don't want that to be, you know, off, and you want every bit of a joint there that you can get. Now, these are just kind of tacks. They may be enough to be permanent, or I may need to go back and put a little more glue on them. We'll see. When I did the ribs here, I did just kind of tack them. I didn't go heavy duty. So I usually don't like doing that when the wing is on the plastic, because it can even though it's plastic, it can still adhere to it. Okay, so you gotta love that thin CA. It doesn't take any time at all. So we are all set. So now I need to do my cut my angle here, and do the dihedral. And probably the best way to do this is kind of a combination of things. Well, actually not. The best way to do this is going to be to anchor it on this side, where it's going to be, you know, where it's right side up. Square this up on the plans, square up the rib, get the dihedral ground into this. The easiest way to do that, it's soft balsa. Just take a piece of sandpaper, roll it up, slide it into the hole, and then just hold it, the rib at an angle, at the angle that it needs to be, and rotate it a little bit. And that will give us our bit of a bevel. So when this is on the plans, it'll be easy enough, as you can see, to lean that rib over, and using our 7-degree gauge, get our dihedral. Then I can trim these pieces, and we'll use our, this is basically fiberglass. It's black, so you might think it's carbon fiber, but it's just black fiberglass. And we'll be epoxying these in place and joining the two wing sections together. So before I glue this on, because I'm going to need to work on the plans that are over there, I'm going to go ahead and build the other wing tip to the point that I've got this assembled, and then I can go ahead and move them over to their opposite sides. Thanks again for watching. Please click like. If you have not subscribed, please do so.